I came to her door as a guest, and left as someone she couldn't forget. I didn't know what to expect when I knocked on her door. Technically, I was just a guest, invited for a casual evening, maybe a few hours of polite conversation. But the moment I stepped into her apartment, the air felt different, warmer somehow, like it held a quiet invitation I hadn't anticipated. She opened the door before I could ring the bell, and for a moment, I simply stared. There she was, graceful, composed, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but effortlessly held it. She smiled, and it wasn't just a smile. It was the kind that reaches your chest first, then settles somewhere deeper, where you realize you're noticing every detail: the curve of her lips, the way her eyes caught the light, the subtle confidence in her posture. I tried to focus on the casual greeting I had rehearsed in my head, but I found myself stumbling over words I didn't even think I'd forget. "Come in," she said, her voice calm but warm. The words were ordinary, yet they carried a softness that made the room feel instantly more intimate. I stepped in, and as I did, the subtle scent of her perfume reached me, something floral, understated, not overpowering, but familiar in a way that made me slightly dizzy. The sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, dust motes floating lazily in golden beams, giving the apartment a soft, almost dreamlike quality. She gestured toward the living room, and I followed, careful not to appear too eager or clumsy. She handed me a drink, coffee, I think, and our fingers brushed ever so slightly. It was just a moment, a fleeting contact, but my skin remembered it. She didn't pull away. Her hand lingered a fraction longer than necessary, enough to make me aware of the energy in the space between us. I cleared my throat, tried to smile naturally, and felt the strange mix of nerves and curiosity settling in my chest. We moved toward the couch, and I couldn't help but notice the subtle elegance in the way she carried herself. She didn't fidget, didn't rush. There was a calmness that made the apartment feel like a sanctuary, like a place where words and silence could coexist without awkwardness. And yet, beneath that calm, I sensed something more, a quiet vulnerability, perhaps, or maybe just the kind of depth you notice only when someone is genuinely real with themselves. As we settled into conversation, I felt the odd sensation of being both an intruder and a welcomed presence. Every glance, every polite laugh, every tilt of her head seemed intentional, yet effortless. It was the kind of first impression that doesn't scream romance, it whispers it. And even as I reminded myself I was just a guest, I felt the slow, undeniable pull of curiosity, the kind that makes you want to stay a little longer, to ask a little more, to notice everything about someone you barely know. By the time I left that evening, I knew something had shifted, even if either of us admitted it. The ordinary act of knocking on a door had become something else entirely, the first step into a story either of us expected to write, but both of us would feel in ways that lingered long after the door closed. Emotional goal, building comfort and subtle tension. After the initial awkwardness faded, we found ourselves in the living room, the soft hum of background music wrapping around us like a gentle cloak. It was the kind of space where words felt natural, but silence didn't. I perched on the edge of the sofa, careful not to seem too forward, while she moved with that quiet grace I couldn't stop noticing. Every gesture, pouring a drink, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, felt deliberate yet unstudied, as though she didn't realize the effect she had on people. We started with small talk. The usual. "How was your day?" and "Did you find the place okay?" But soon, the conversation deepened without either of us forcing it. She spoke with ease about her favorite books, the music she loved, and even little quirks about her neighborhood that made me smile. And I found myself opening up more than I expected, not in a confessional way, but in the way you talk to someone whose attention feels genuine, whose presence invites honesty. The age difference hovered quietly in the background of my mind, a reminder that this connection was unusual, but it didn't weigh heavily. Instead, it lent a sense of fascination. She spoke of experiences I hadn't yet had, of perspectives I hadn't considered, and every time she laughed at a joke, soft and sincere, I felt the room grow warmer. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled slightly, the tilt of her head when she listened intently, the way her hand rested casually on her lap yet seemed poised to move in a gesture that felt intimate even in its subtlety. At one point, as I reached for the sugar to stir my coffee, our hands brushed. Just a light touch, but it lingered, a fraction of a second too long to be accidental. I caught myself noticing the warmth of her skin, the effortless way she didn't pull back. She smiled, and it was as if the room itself held its breath. I couldn't tell if it was the age difference or the ease of her confidence, but something about that tiny moment made the ordinary act of conversation feel electric. We drifted into shared laughter over a small mishap in her kitchen, and I realized how natural it felt to be here, in her space, with her. The conversation flowed effortlessly, the pauses comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the quiet curiosity of two people beginning to notice one another. Every time our eyes met, I felt a spark of understanding, like we were silently acknowledging that something unspoken had begun. By the end of the evening, I left with more than just memories of polite conversation. I carried the warmth of her presence, the subtle weight of her gaze, and the realization that what began as casual curiosity was slowly turning into something far more compelling. I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was someone whose attention she had quietly noticed, someone whose presence had begun to matter. And though neither of us said it aloud, I felt the promise of a story unfolding, one built on gentle glances, lingering touches, and the slow, irresistible pull of two lives quietly intertwining. The evening had settled into a quiet rhythm. Outside, the sun had dipped low, casting a soft amber glow across her living room. I hadn't realized how long we'd been talking until she paused, her gaze distant for a moment, as if she were weighing whether to share something private. I noticed the subtle shift in her posture, the slight slump of her shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted in her lap. Something in her told me that she trusted me enough to let the walls fall just a little. "I guess sometimes it gets lonely," she said, her voice low but steady. She didn't elaborate immediately, instead allowing the silence to fill the space, as if testing the waters. I felt the pull to respond, to bridge the gap between curiosity and care, but I hesitated, conscious of the fragility of this moment. I simply nodded, signaling my attention, letting her know I was present and willing to listen. She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes steady yet soft. "People see the surface, you know? The confidence, the control. But underneath, it's just..." She trailed off, a faint sigh escaping her lips. I noticed the slight quiver in her voice, the vulnerability she rarely let anyone see. And in that instant, I realized why I was drawn to her, not just her grace or beauty, but the layers she carried, the quiet strength balanced by human fragility. Without thinking, I reached toward her, my hand hovering briefly before lightly brushing against her shoulder. The touch was gentle, meant to convey reassurance without overstepping. She didn't flinch, instead, her eyes softened, and she gave the smallest of smiles. That single, fleeting contact spoke volumes: comfort, understanding, a silent acknowledgement that I was here for her, and that she was safe in sharing herself. We sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full of unspoken understanding. I noticed the warmth radiating from her, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the mug in her hands, and the subtle tension in her shoulders easing ever so slightly. My own chest tightened, a mix of admiration, protectiveness, and an unfamiliar longing I hadn't expected to feel so soon. Then, softly, she continued, sharing a memory that revealed not just her challenges, but her hopes, her fears, and the small joys that had stayed hidden from most people. I listened intently, occasionally offering small words of encouragement, careful not to interrupt the delicate flow of her openness. And as she spoke, I realized that in this quiet exchange, the distance between guest and host was shrinking. Something deeper was forming, a bond built on honesty, attentiveness, and the subtle intimacy of two people who trusted each other enough to be human together. By the end of the night, I left with a new awareness, not only of her, but of myself. I understood that connection wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it lived in quiet confessions, in soft touches, in shared silences that said everything words could not. And for the first time, I wasn't just a guest in her home. I was a witness to her heart, and somehow, that made me feel irrevocably present in her life. A few days later, I found myself back in her apartment, this time under the pretense of helping her with a small project, organizing her bookshelves, something innocuous that promised a few hours of distraction. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt the familiar warmth, the subtle energy that seemed to gather around her presence. She greeted me with that quiet smile that had become my favorite, and I realized how much I had come to anticipate it. We began casually, sorting books by size and color at first, exchanging light-hearted comments about the oddities we found on the shelves. But soon, the playful banter started to evolve, the kind that carried an undercurrent of tension neither of us directly acknowledged. She reached for a book at the same time as me, and our hands collided, lingering briefly. I felt the warmth of her skin, the gentle pressure of her fingers against mine, and I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. She looked up at me, her eyes glinting with amusement, and I caught the hint of a blush on her cheeks. "You're too slow," she teased, nudging me lightly with her elbow. The contact was subtle, but it sent a flutter through me, the kind of reaction I didn't bother hiding. I retorted with a grin, brushing past her shoulder as I reached for another book. The air between us seemed charged, though either of us spoke the words that might name it. It was in the brush of skin, the shared laughter, the way our movements mirrored each other, as though we were unconsciously choreographed. At one point, a small mishap, a book slipping from the shelf, brought us physically closer. I instinctively reached to steady it, my hand brushing against hers again. This time, neither of us pulled away. Our eyes met, holding a silent conversation, and I realized how natural it felt to be this close, to share space in a way that was both comfortable and quietly electric. She smiled softly, a look that suggested she felt it too, the subtle thrill of a connection that was growing with each shared gesture. The playful teasing continued, each joke, each nudge, each brush of our hands layering a quiet tension between us. There was no rush, no need to label the feeling, just a recognition that something meaningful was unfolding. I noticed the way she laughed at my clumsy attempts to organize her shelves, the way her fingers lingered over a book she handed me, the way her presence seemed to make the room warmer. By the time the task was finished, the apartment was filled not just with neatly arranged books, but with a sense of intimacy I hadn't expected. We lingered near the shelves, reluctant to break the closeness that had developed so naturally. Every glance, every accidental touch, every shared laugh had quietly woven a connection that neither of us could ignore. I wasn't just a guest or a helper anymore. I was someone she seemed to enjoy being near, someone whose presence made her smile in ways she hadn't shown me before. And in that moment, I understood how subtle affection could carry more weight than words, how playful tension could speak louder than declarations, and how slowly, deliberately, the distance between two people could dissolve through laughter, glances, and the gentlest of touches. It was one of those evenings that seemed suspended between ordinary and extraordinary. The city outside her window had quieted, leaving only the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional flicker of neon from a passing car. Inside, the apartment glowed under the warm, amber light of a single lamp, casting soft shadows that made the room feel private, almost sacred. We sat side by side on the sofa, a casual arrangement that now carried an unspoken intimacy neither of us had anticipated. For a long while, we spoke little, letting silence fill the space between our words. But in that silence, I felt more than I had in hours of conversation, an awareness of her presence that was almost tangible. The warmth of her shoulder pressed lightly against mine, the subtle scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the way her fingers occasionally brushed against mine as we adjusted our positions. Every small contact seemed to speak volumes. I found myself stealing glances at her, noticing details I hadn't before. The slight curve of her smile when she thought I wasn't looking, the thoughtful crease at the corner of her eyes, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear with a gentleness that made me ache with a quiet longing. It hit me then, this wasn't just curiosity or admiration. I was drawn to her, in a way that went beyond appearances, beyond simple companionship. And she, I realized, felt it too. She would catch my gaze and hold it a second longer than necessary, a subtle acknowledgement that whatever was unfolding between us wasn't entirely accidental. There was a softness in her expression, a vulnerability carefully balanced with her usual confidence, that made me aware of the emotional stakes for both of us. We were no longer merely guest and host. We were participants in a delicate dance, each aware of the growing tension, yet neither rushing forward. A small, ordinary gesture made it undeniable. She reached for the teacup on the table, and our fingers touched. There was no rush, no overt declaration, just the warmth, the gentle pressure of skin against skin, and the lingering connection it left behind. I felt my heart tighten, and I knew she did too. It was a moment of quiet confession, conveyed without words, a shared understanding that what had begun as casual acquaintance was evolving into something deeper, something neither of us could fully name yet. We both shifted slightly, leaning toward each other without realizing it, sharing a glance that carried 1,000 unspoken thoughts. I thought about the age difference, the whispers of doubt that occasionally surfaced in my mind, yet in her presence, none of it mattered. She seemed to sense the same, an acknowledgement that this connection was unusual, perhaps even risky, but undeniably real. By the end of that evening, I left her apartment feeling both lighter and heavier than I had when I arrived. Lighter because a silent understanding had formed between us, heavier because the awareness of what we were feeling, and not yet saying, was almost tangible. The quiet realizations of that night lingered, like the soft echo of a song just out of reach, leaving me with the undeniable certainty that neither of us would look at our interactions the same way again. Something had shifted, subtly yet irrevocably, and I knew our story had truly begun. The night had fallen completely, leaving the city cloaked in darkness save for the distant glow of streetlights. Her apartment felt like an island of warmth and quiet, every shadow softened by the gentle lamplight. We were alone, a rare moment without interruption, and the atmosphere had shifted from casual comfort to something charged, though either of us had yet given it a name. We sat on the sofa, closer than usual, the space between us shrinking almost imperceptibly. I could feel the warmth of her arm brushing against mine with each subtle movement, and the soft scent of her perfume seemed stronger in the stillness of the night. For the first time, the silence between us didn't feel like something to fill, it felt heavy with meaning, as though every unsaid word was hovering in the air, waiting to be acknowledged. I didn't expect to feel this way, I said finally, my voice low, almost breaking the fragile calm. My eyes met hers, searching for a hint of what she might be feeling, and found it there, a flicker of hesitation, of vulnerability, of the same unspoken pull I had felt for weeks. She looked at me, her expression softening. Neither did I, she admitted, her words deliberate but quiet. It's unexpected, but it feels real. Her hand moved slightly, brushing against mine, lingering just long enough to let me know that this wasn't just casual. There was a gentle courage in her touch, the kind that quietly bridges the distance between two people without words. The confession didn't come with grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It was in the small, intentional contact, our fingers brushing again, the warmth of her shoulder pressing against mine, the slight tilt of her head as she regarded me with a gaze that held both curiosity and sincerity. It was in the way our breaths seemed to fall into rhythm, in the subtle incline toward each other that neither of us resisted. I felt my chest tighten, a combination of relief and longing, as if simply acknowledging what we felt was both terrifying and exhilarating. There was no rush to define the future, no need for immediate promises. For that moment, it was enough to simply exist in the shared acknowledgement of our feelings, to let the intimacy of the moment sink in, unspoken but profoundly understood. We lingered in that space for what felt like an eternity, hands occasionally brushing, shoulders touching, eyes meeting in quiet acknowledgement of what was between us. Every small gesture, every fleeting smile, every gentle glance carried a weight far greater than words could convey. And in that silence, I realized something undeniable. The bond we had formed wasn't just fleeting attraction. It was the beginning of something deeper, a connection built on trust, vulnerability, and a slow, careful discovery of one another. When the moment ended, we didn't rush to leave or fill the space with chatter. We simply existed side by side, aware of the shift, aware of the closeness, aware that this night had changed everything. And though the future remained unwritten, for the first time, I felt certain that what we were feeling was real, and that it would linger, quietly and persistently, long after the night ended. The day of my departure arrived far too quickly, though in truth, it felt like we had been quietly entwined for weeks. The morning light streamed gently through the curtains, soft and forgiving, illuminating the apartment with a calm that contrasted sharply with the whirl of emotions in my chest. I hadn't realized how much I had grown attached to this space, and to her, until the reality of leaving pressed against me. She met me at the door, her expression serene yet tinged with the subtle vulnerability I had grown to recognize as uniquely hers. There was no rush, no awkward shuffling. We simply stood there, letting the silence stretch, knowing that what we had shared didn't need words to exist. And yet, every glance, every small movement was charged with meaning. As I reached for my bag, our hands brushed once again, light, fleeting, but intentional. I felt a warmth spread through me, a mix of comfort, longing, and something that hovered dangerously close to the ache of farewell. She smiled, the kind of quiet, knowing smile that carried 1,000 unspoken sentiments: gratitude, affection, the recognition that this connection would linger even in absence. "Take care," she said softly, her voice steady but layered with emotion. It wasn't just a casual farewell. It was an acknowledgement of everything we had come to mean to each other in this brief but profound time. I nodded, unsure whether to respond with words or let the moment speak for itself. In the end, I chose the latter. Instead, I allowed my fingers to linger lightly against hers before letting go, committing the sensation to memory. We stood like that for a heartbeat longer, suspended between parting and lingering, until I finally stepped back. The city beyond her door felt brighter, somehow, even as a quiet ache settled in my chest. I glanced back, and she met my eyes once more, holding the connection for a fleeting moment that felt like an eternity. No words were necessary. The emotion was clear, raw in its simplicity, and profoundly satisfying. Walking away, I felt a mixture of melancholy and hope. The door closed softly behind me, but the memory of her presence, the gentle warmth of her touch, and the subtle intimacy we had shared stayed with me. I realized that what we had wasn't fleeting. It had changed me, leaving a mark on my heart that would shape the way I approached connection, trust, and affection in the future. And though our paths might diverge, I knew we had created something enduring, a quiet bond built on honesty, vulnerability, and slow, deliberate understanding. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about the accumulation of small moments, the unspoken acknowledgement of emotions, and the lingering resonance of human connection. As I moved through the city, the memory of her smile, her glance, her subtle touches followed me like a quiet echo, a reminder that some relationships are not measured in time or distance but in depth and impact. And in that realization, I felt a bittersweet satisfaction. I had entered her life as a guest, and I left as someone she missed, and in turn, someone I would never forget.